and looking over the empty seats, I think I scared some folks off last week. If you don't have a book, there's books up here. I made extra copies. You can take them home. You can watch the video later. For folks who are watching the video, you can either come here and get a book, or I can email you the notes, or Mike Pence. No, not Mike Pence. Chris Pence. Chris Pence can get you a copy. He's got a copy too. All right, how many of you, and before we start this, how many of you, the assignment last week was to read the historical background, et cetera, that was between pages 17 and 20-something on, 27 or so, 28. How many of you were able to do that?
I did not.
One.
We'll get this assignment.
Pam, will you take their names?
No, because my name has to be at the top of the list.
Right now.
But I was like, so everybody know you're late?
Copy of the notes here if you don't have any.
Thank you.
We're talking about interpretation. Now, this is kind of interesting.
That's a warrior right there. She's killed that.
I've heard said, and I like to say, intent is prior to content. Okay? What that essentially means is how you think determines how you see life, what you get. Okay? Now, and the meaning of this is, somewhat obscure, but it plays. I see it all the time. I publish these notes. I've taught this class since 2004, something like that, and 4 or 5 churches now, 4 churches. And so I have these notes, and my 401k administrator for my company and I were having lunch, and he was mentioning something about Revelation, and I was kind of talking to him about it. He says, oh, and so I gave him the notes, and he gave them to somebody else. And there's a men's group that meets of business leaders in Lexington, and I was invited because of this Revelation study, and they were going to start Revelation, and they thought it'd be good to invite me. And I've been looking for a men's Bible study. We don't have one here. Never can seem to get one going. So I was interested in it. And so he asked for a copy of my notes, the teacher to this class, and I gave them to him, and 3 days later he handed them back to me, and I said, wow, that was pretty quick. And I said, did you read the whole thing? And he says, oh, I got about halfway through. And he handed it back. Okay, what do you think he bumped into? What do you think he bumped into about halfway through?
Something he didn't like.
Okay, all right. So when he started the class, he said, I'm a futurist. Okay. Okay, and that is important. Oh, by the way, we're going to talk a little bit about the economic scene, the food, how it carried disease, etc. So I thought I'd bring in disease food. I have rye was the staple of the Roman people, and also spelt. So I've made 2 loaves of spelt sourdough bread with fresh butter. All right, I see an open mouth over there. And came out of the oven.
Someone's got to eat the first meat.
I was kind of bribing you to come to class, so the people who reached out, you say, hey, you come, you might look. So, interpretation are widely varied. Now, you guys may have looked at your mail, saw this. Did you see this in your mail? Well, I collect these things, okay? This is the Bible prophecy, Revelation. This one said Mr. 666, and what is mating prediction today in Bible prophecy. I'll pass these around. Well, let me tell you, Revelations is still a hot topic even today. I'll just pass those around for interest. bright, colorful. You don't see that for the book of John, do you? Okay? You don't see anybody, those things are just not done. So this is a book of interest. But again, how you begin, what your thinking is determines how you interpret this book. The futurist holds that the first few chapters are about the early church, and the rest is all something that happens in the future, not yet. And most of these folks are millennialists. They believe in that 1,000-year earthly reign on Jesus' second coming. Okay? The others are continuous historical view. Those folks who believe that the book is revealed through history. It may have been revealed in the two popes of the Roman Catholic Church when there was two popes and the church was separate, the Eastern and Western Empire of the church. Some things have already happened, some things have not. Some talk about the Reformation being in here and Mohammedanism, etc. There's the philosophy of history faith. They're all spiritual conflict. It's somewhat like Dante's Inferno, which is a book of whatever, all happening on the spiritual realm. The preterists feel that it all was fulfilled at the time of John and at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's when it's all rolled up into that. And then the last view, the one I take, is the historical background, that this was written to the Christians for 250 years after Christ, who had to go through some very intense persecutions, and it was meant to be a help and encouragement, and perhaps it was written somewhat in code to keep it from being used against them, maybe, or perhaps it was encouragement to those who really wanted to dig in and learn. So with that, we're going to go back and look at some of the history of the Roman come to being, what happened at that time. The Romans came out of the Etruscans, and by the time Christ came, they believed in this what's called peace of the gods, pa diorum, peace of God. Their concept was that if you please God in sacrifice, then your society will run well. He will bless everything you do. Now, it seems odd that these Romans were very pagan, not pagan, they had multiple religions.
Pantheistic.
Pantheistic, there you go, thank you. Which really makes it odd that you think, okay, if they're pantheistic, why do they have trouble with another religion? Why do you think that is?
Well, a religion that expresses singularity,
Okay,
they weren't having any trouble with all the multiple.
yeah, they would incorporate them, etc. But as long as you did your thing, that's okay, but I can do my thing and you can do my thing. So that was part of it. But part of it was as society started to deteriorate, things in society, the food, the wars, the incursions by the armies to the north, etc. Rome fought against the Persian Empire for 795 years. They always had war. And they thought that if the Christians aren't paying tribute to these gods, then we don't have everybody doing what we want them to do, and that's why things have gone wrong. Not because of anything we did, etc. Their theology was very much based on rite and ritual and less on a moral code. So they bumped into that. Rome was able to take over the world because they had enforcement of authority. They set up a rule of law. They backed that law by extreme torture and death, okay? Forced people to do things. They had a trade system, and they had military, a great military. And what they couldn't conquer, they had the wealth to buy off. Okay? So when later in the history of the Roman kingdom, they didn't have the money to buy off the Gauls, didn't have the money to buy off the Germanic tribes, and therefore they came in and sacked Rome, took away that wealth, and it just made things worse. Then, a little bit later, towards Domitian, the emperors were seen as deities. Maybe this came from the Oriental influence. I think it was, here if you read this, Caesar Augustus, when he was killed, they made him a deity after he was dead. And that began to inculcate into the view of this, the Roman leader. Now, you may remember that they had a senate. That all disappeared in about 60 AD, BC. That senate went away. Where we have, like what we have here, is this rule by representation. It went to a dictatorial rule. Early persecution was mainly from the Jews, and you can see some of that through Titus's, which is Domitian's brother. He had several actions against the Jews, culminating in the destruction of the temple and the mass suicide in AD 70 at Masada. And so, you know, initially the persecution was from the Jews. The Romans at the early part didn't really care if there was another religion. It was just an offshoot of the religion. And the Jews had multiple offshoots. They had the Essenes, they had etc. They had all sorts of extra offshoots. They didn't really seem to care. In contrast, you know, and what it was Rome had problem with the Jewish state because they were disobedient, not because of their religion. It's just that they were disobedient. Why were they disobedient?
They didn't venerate the people that they wanted to venerate.
Right. Okay. And they wanted their homeland free of invaders. They wanted to drive them out. They wanted to rule themselves. They weren't like any of the other vassal states. He said, okay, well, as long as you let us do what we want to do, we'll do what you want to do. We're okay being a part of the Empire of Rome. Early on, the Jews and the Christians considered themselves loyal to Rome and the state. And their teachings here in Matthew, and Romans, and Timothy all back that up. The dispute arose not from clashes between the earthly kingdom, but clashes between spiritual kingdoms. Ephesians 6:11 through 13 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So, out of these civil wars that rose after Julius Caesar in 44 BC, this new form of government was dictatorial. And the imperator, the Caesar, became god of our Rome. Civil war came after Caesar's death, and there was a power struggle between Octavian and Mark Antony. And the armies of Brutus and Cassius, various leaders had their own armies. Wouldn't it be great to have your own army, guys? In 27 BC, Octavian was conferred the Senate title of Augustus, which, according to Tacitus, the Roman historian, said meant the signified and possessor of superhuman increase, the augmented and sanctified. So he became you know, kind of like Hitler being the Führer. Okay, he's not a leader; he is the leader. And we begin to see that. Now, it wasn't very developed at that time. You can read here on your own that Tiberius followed Augustus. He did a lot of good things. Caligula, however, insisted on being called a god, probably because he had some pretty bad behavior, as you may have understood from your history. Nero reigned from 54 to 68. And that's where we see the first Christian oppressions. It is said that by punishment for the fire in Rome, that many Christians were put to death as sport in the gladiatorial games. They were tied to poles, and they were lighted. They were set on fire to provide light for the games and for meals. How would you like to go to a meal? Hey, I'm having dinner. Come to my house. And, oh, by the way, here's a Christian. We're going to burn him to provide light for us. Seems kind of, your and my complaints about being a Christian seems pretty pale for that. Nero was succeeded by 3 men in quick succession: Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Vitellius was noted for his gluttony and cruelty. Vespasian, 69 to 79, was chosen by the army to lead after the removal of Vitellius. And he, let me think here, some evidence that Vespasian was killed by his brother Domitian, who poisoned him in AD 81. Domitian's reign began benignly, but as the historian Suetonius said, his vices were at fires balanced by his virtue. Later, he transferred his virtues into vices too. So under Domitian is where you see some pretty terrible things.
Was it Vespasian, or however you pronounce, that had the contact with Josephus? Was he the one that, where Josephus had actually predicted his rule?
Maybe, I don't know. I don't know much about the writings of Josephus.
I mean, it was one of those during that destruction of Jerusalem that, I mean, Josephus was actually a Jewish military officer.
Yeah. And historian, yes.
And yet he still was allowed to live and to proceed to document and do his work. I mean, and I understood that this was under Vespasian because of some relationship he had, and I didn't know if you knew anything about it.
You know, I don't think the persecution really started hitting until after Domitian. And you can read here, it takes a while. After Domitian, you have some good and bad empires. You know, the religion was primarily seen as a political thing to incorporate places that they took over, countries they took over. They inculcated, they brought their religion into theirs. And you say, well, I worship so-and-so, and they say, well, you know, those guys worship so-and-so, but they do this cool thing. We're going to go ahead and do that. Religion to them wasn't a pure thing. There wasn't a standard. You could change it by the whim of the society. So, you know, through the next 2.5 centuries, the persecutions came and went. It's during the time of Domitian that being a Christian was first seen as a crime against the state. And so we'll see some of that as we go down here. Some Christians believed in withdrawing from society. And that kept up until about 600 AD, when you begin to see these monks and monasteries where they pulled themselves out of society in order to keep from being polluted. Some historians count 10 principal persecutions, and I'll list them here on the top of page 21. Rome misunderstood Christianity. They didn't think of it as a religion. Pliny in AD 111 wrote Trajan asking if a pardon could be extended to a Christian if they denied Christ, and if it was a crime to bear the name Christian. He had, when presented with an individual, asked if they were a Christian, warning them the penalty of guilt. Having been asked the question twice more, so 3 times, and remember how many times did Peter deny Christ? 3 times. How many times did he say, you know, I love you afterwards? 3 times, okay? Is that inconsequential? Maybe not. So they, having been asked the questions twice more, if they were persisted, they were led away for execution on the basis of obstinacy and stubbornness. Okay? They just won't give it up. They didn't consider it to be anything more than a philosophy. Under Hadrian, there was a clear differentiation between Christians and Jews. So by AD 135, Christianity, no longer really by the Romans, really was seen as a separate sect of the Jews. They were seen separate. About 166, Christians were sought out for persecution. The declining state of the empire was blamed on the failure of the growing numbers of Christians to worship pagan deities. So they sought that paudiorum, and it didn't seem to change what was going on in society. Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180, were bitterly opposed to Christianity, as they saw them as atheists, people who did not believe in the multiple gods and would not worship them. This was seen as a form of treason. So this is where we first begin to see evidence of torture of Christians to get them to change their allegiance to Christ. When Aurelius died in battle in 180, his son Commodus continued this form of persecution, and he is known as the second Domitian. There is perhaps something in Revelation that says this once died has now come back, and we may look at that here. Other cults came out. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There were other cults, savior and mystery cults. We'll do that in the religious scene coming up. So the state started to decline fast. Taxation was heavily done. You know, Rome existed, was able to do what it was able to do because, one, it had its slave labor. So they had 50 to 60% of their population was slaves, so essentially free.
Say that again.
50 to 60% of their population was slave labor. Okay? Egypt, the breadbasket of the world at time, had a 70% slave basis to work their fields. Bread was free or nearly free in the Roman Empire. Okay? That was the basis on which their economy ran. So when that started to decline and the trade routes failed and the disease that came in through bread, okay, what happened to their economy? It started to fail. You started to get inflation. You had all sorts of other troubles, and you can read all that here. What is our society based on economically? Cheap what?
Cheap food.
No, cheap oil.
Cheap oil.
Cheap oil. Price of oil goes up, price of everything else goes up, right? Our entire economic system is based on cheap oil. Okay? We're not in the same boat they were.
I guess we've learned how to make machines our slaves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but
Sure.
yet we now have, that requires oil.
Yeah. Dionysius continued with the decrees that came out after Maximus, and leaders of the church, elders, deacons, etc., were required to pay homage to the pagan gods. If they refused, they were put to death. Oftentimes, their children were put to death in front of them in order to encourage the leaders to recant. Okay? There was an active hunting down of them. They would even do this to the people of the royal households. Several of the Caesars put their own families to death because they believed in Christ. So they really started ramping up the pressure. After Diocletian is when we see a large pressing persecution of the church. About this time arose a powerful pagan prophet in the writer Porphyry. He was a writer with many expressed his hatred of Christianity. Much of the opposition to Christianity at this time relied on his writings. In 303, Diocletian, after meeting with Galerius, at Rome at time had all sorts of dual Roman leaders, Caesars, etc. There were many, maybe as many as 10 at one time. He issued some official edicts against Christianity. The fifth of these edicts were under Maximilian. Required everyone, regardless of age and sex, to sacrifice at the temple under the supervision of the magistrates. Punishment of torture and death were severe. There is record that if you paid obeisance to the god, or at least to Caesar, that you got a card, you got some sort of official note or whatever that allowed you to buy food, allowed you to possess your home, and allowed you to travel. Without that, you were restricted. I'm going to let you kind of read the rest on your own at home. Please do so. It wasn't until Constantine that you begin to see a lowering of the persecution. Constantine's mother became a Christian. And some say that he became a Christian after witnessing during a battle a cross appearing in the sky. It wasn't until just before he died that he was baptized, but he did decide to issue a Catholic, which is essentially saying we're going to consolidate the various thoughts that are in Christianity and bring them into a one central Catholic, and that's what Catholic means. This is where we see the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church, the official state-sanctioned church and its theology. That's why everything is written down. That's why when the preacher or the priest says one thing, the audience answers exactly the same way. Everything is ritualized in order to remove all the strange things that were happening. Let's get to the economic scene. Trade plays a huge role in the Roman existence. In fact, they had the best known road system, and they had ships, etc. And they were the masters of trade. And through the book of Revelation, we see all sorts of judgments against that trade. We see that trade start to fall apart. Now you say, okay, it was really well developed. They had the best roads. In fact, some are still used today. They had the best series of harbors that they built, and they're still used today for shipping. But I think, and there's some in those books there that believe that their primary economic base was still agriculture. It was wheat. And at this time, that was what drove everything. As an example of this, they said, okay, they had this really good trade, but when there was a fire in Rome, next to the temple where Nero was, the reason why it spread so quickly is those buildings were were so jam-packed. Everything was stacked in walkways and hallways and streets, and flammable materials next to oils and those kinds of things, pitch and tar, and it spread very quickly because they hadn't built the infrastructure safely. They rapidly developed this stuff, but it couldn't sustain. They had the best roads, but they preferred to ship everything by water because it was cheaper. You could do it faster than you could put it on a cart and haul it down some road with horses. You and I drive cars that are based on the Roman measurement. Okay? The Roman measurement was the width of two horses' rear ends that could be done to draw a cart, and the wheelbase was essentially set that way. And every city had a road with crosswalks. Have you ever seen pictures of Pompeii, et cetera? They were all based upon that. The train wheels of trains that were developed are exactly the same width of the wheels of the Roman carts, and our cars are exactly the same one. You can take one of our cars and put it on a railroad tracks without its tires and roll down the road. So they developed a system. They had water. That was important as well. So they began, because of this ability to move food, they began large cities where people lived in cities close together, and the farms were spread out, etc. So the problem with that is that disease could run rampant if disease was introduced. They also had, well, go back a little bit. Trade guilds, as part of that trade society, were very territorial and segmented. It was kind of like our Teamster thing. You couldn't hire something unless you went and gave offerings to the god of the Teamsters. You know, you had to go, and there was a god of the silversmiths, as we were called in the Bible. There was a god of the goldsmiths. There was a god of whatever, and they each had their own territory, and that hindered trade to a certain amount. Internal struggles, civil wars. Each Caesar had his own army. Each general had their own army, and so if they didn't like somebody or want to take over the power, they would fight with somebody else. There were civil wars all the time. And in fact, at one point, you know, Jesus says if you know, somebody asks you for their cloak, give them your tunic as well. If someone asks you to carry their load a mile, the Romans initially at the time of Christ could ask anybody to carry their burden for a mile, just a mile. But later, when they couldn't afford to pay their military was given carte blanche. They could ask you to do anything. In fact, you could, as a military person, you could go live in somebody's house and they were required to take care of you because they could no longer afford to pay their armies. They made wealth by taking over other countries and taking their gold and their silver and their wealth. But when they could no longer do that, they could no longer pay their armies. So this caused inflation. Low taxation rates for Roman citizens, free bread. All the games were free. So you could go to the, you know, it's kind of a way of pleasing the society. Any Caesar who tried to introduce coinage that had silver or copper or other materials and alloy with the gold were killed. So they could not get off the gold standard. So some estimates by the late 250s AD and well into the 400s, this inflation required a week's wage to purchase a day's worth of food. So when we see that in Revelation chapter 6, a quart of wheat for a day's wages and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. So, perhaps God is introducing these punishments in order to encourage change in the society. I'm going to kind of go over the military scene and not cover it here because I want to get a little bit farther. Please read that at home. All this stuff is going to be stuff we're going to refer to as we go further down. Epidemiologic scene. Okay. Now we have production of food in faraway places. It's all being shipped into centers. The Roman Empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in England clear out to the steppes in Mongolia. From Lower Egypt clear up to Norway and Sweden. Okay? And huge footprint. And some people think that the plagues were unique and that they may have been transported not by mice or rats or fleas, etc., but they actually came in on the rye bread itself. So anywhere that rye bread it went. The other thing is the Romans did really good with water. In fact, their daily use of water exceeds the daily use of water at the time I wrote this, I think in 2002. So they had a really good water system. In fact, they had lead pipes bringing water into your house, and you were taxed for that or paid for that water based upon the size of the valve that led into your house to feed your springs and your, etc. There was running water everywhere. They had running water toilets, and water was everywhere. But they didn't understand disease, and at the time of one of the wars, the common practice of the day for armies in the north was to dispose of the dead of war or pestilence in the rivers. At the height of the war and disease in 75 AD, it was said that the river was so full of corpses you could walk across it on them without getting your feet wet. This was the same water that 300 miles to the south was brought in on aqueducts into everybody's house. These, I think from a biblical standpoint, we'll look at this. The Christian physician Cyprian in AD 250, who is named the Cyprian plague, described the symptoms as violent diarrhea and vomiting, an ulcerated sore throat, burning fever, and gangrene of hands and feet. The Cyprian plague was also unique in its spread pandemically from Egypt in the south to Scotland in the north with very falling speed. It essentially encompassed all that was the Roman Empire. It was spread from person to person, but also articles of clothing. Morbidity was higher than with any other plague. The number who died that were more than the number who survived. It's interesting to note that this plague seemed to coalesce the church. Cyprian and his folks were baptizing 200 to 300 persons a day. The plagues that we see in Revelation may be there in order to drive people towards the church. Okay? When your earthly footing is removed, where do you turn? In fact, one of these books right here, Cartwright, Disease and History, states that he doubts that Christianity would have been successful if it were not for the plagues that ravaged imperial Rome. Think about that. All right, religious cults. Read that later. But I want to ask you in the 2 or 3 minutes that we've got left, okay? The church is trying to survive. Jesus has gone on. He's left behind some small band of folks to carry things on. The Roman Empire and the Jews sought to destroy the church, right? If you were a leader back then, what would you say about, okay, how are we going to make the church survive? Okay? How do we do that? They're killing our elders. They're torturing our people. How do we do that? Okay? It could be that the folks who are called Nicolaitans were folks who said, it's okay to pay homage to Caesar because we know he's not a god. He's not a dog either. It's okay to sacrifice to your trade god, okay? Because we know that's not a real god, okay? And be obedient to Christ. Okay? They could have gotten around, they could have survived. Okay? Yet all the words in Revelation says, do not do that. If you say, let the church survive, okay, we have to do whatever we have to do to make this church survive. The exact opposite happened. Under the greatest persecution known to man, 250 years, 250 years, the church blew up. More people, you'll see that, more people became Christian during this time than any time in history. Persecution was good for the church, for the true church. That's the lesson that we will learn from this. Okay? It will teach all the early Christians what you had to do by telling you about something else. He says, you want to know what's important, what's real, I'm going to tell you about heaven and what all's happened up there. Okay? I'm going to tell you what's really important so that you can do something different. Jesus came to this world to change our thinking. He says, oh, this is like this, but it's different. Or it's just like this. He came here just to change our thinking because we had it all wrong. Because of that, what we do is different. Okay? Questions? I know it's a lot, we've covered a lot. We haven't even gotten into the book yet. Next week.
Makes our job today seem fairly easy.
It does, doesn't it? As elders, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're kind of herding sheep nowadays, aren't you? Stomp on that little fire. Oh, there's that little fire.
Exactly.
You know, we're not pulling you before some magistrate torturing your children. Want you to give up Christianity. All right, please read that. It's going to be important as we refer back to those pieces of history and disease and economy and trade and wheat and all that kind of stuff as we go along.
You know, it seems as smart as they were on the health side, they would have been a little smarter.
You would think so.
You know, but we got the same thing today.
Yeah.
Expand on that, Joe, a little.
The excavations at Pompeii are just hugely revealing. You know, it was wiped out by this big pyroclastic flow and sealed. They're finding stuff in there that you just wouldn't believe. Their society was extremely advanced in certain ways and extremely archaic in other ways. Yet we still face that today. We say, oh, we got this great society now. You can AI anything and blah, blah, blah. And yet there's some of it just has no concept of this other side. So I think the battle still goes on.
Exactly. It's a different nature.
Yeah. So I feel like I kind of glassed over quite a few pages there, but
Very good.
it's probably easier if you read it.